50 missiles, $23,400,000. That is the contract the U.S. Navy just signed with Castelion in June 2026 for an early production batch of Blackbeard hypersonic missiles rated at more than Mach 5. Welcome back to EST documentary. Here is what the math behind that number actually shows. On the surface, this looks like a routine procurement story. A defense startup wins a Navy contract, a new missile enters production, the press release goes out, everyone moves on. That is how most coverage of this contract has treated it. A new weapon, a new vendor, nothing unusual. But the contract itself is not really the story. It is the price tag on a problem the Navy has been carrying since the first $40 million hypersonic interceptor came off the production line years ago. A problem that has nothing to do with whether these missiles fly, and everything to do with how many a fleet can actually afford to keep flying. This contract did not create that problem. It just put a number on the fix. A weapon that can outrun and outmaneuver almost any defense system on the planet should be the easiest sell in military procurement. The U.S. Navy has had that weapon for years, in the form of the long-range hypersonic weapon and the conventional prompt strike missile, both flying at more than Mach 5, both engineered to slip past layered air defenses that stop almost everything else in the sky. That part of the equation has never been the problem. Nobody questions whether a maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle can beat a radar system built for slower, more predictable threats. The problem is what happens after the missile leaves the launcher, because each one of those missiles costs somewhere between $40 and $50 million to build. A weapon nobody can stop is not the same as a weapon anybody can afford to fire more than a handful of times. Speed and penetration solve a tactical problem. They do not solve a budget problem, and they do not solve a production problem. Those are separate equations, and a missile that wins the first one can still lose the second. In a fight that lasts longer than a single news cycle, it is usually the second equation that decides who keeps shooting and who goes quiet first. History is full of weapons that won every engagement they were used in and still lost the campaign, simply because the side that built them ran out before the other side did. EST documentary does not audit whether these missiles work. They work. What this channel audits is what happens to a military that has to keep paying for them, one launch at a time, in a war that does not end in an afternoon. That audit starts with the price tag everyone already knows about, and what it actually buys once the math gets run all the way through. Start with what the premium hypersonic class actually does, because it is not a small thing. The long-range hypersonic weapon and the conventional prompt strike missile are built to fly at more than 5 times the speed of sound, on a glide path that can shift mid-flight rather than follow a fixed arc. Traditional missile defense is built around predictable trajectories, fixed timing windows, and radar tracks that assume the incoming object will keep behaving like a standard ballistic missile. A maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle breaks that assumption on purpose, and that is the entire point of the design. That is the pitch for this class of weapon. Outrun the interceptor, outmaneuver the radar, and arrive before the defense system finishes deciding what it is even looking at. Against most existing air defense architectures, that pitch holds up in practice, not just on a spec sheet. It is one of the most capable strike systems the United States has ever fielded, and the engineering behind it is real, not marketing language. None of that is the part this video is questioning. The capability is not the weak point, and nothing about the cost problem changes how well the missile performs once it is in the air. The weak point is what that capability costs to keep flying. Building a vehicle that can survive the heat of Mach 5 flight, hold a maneuvering glide path, and still hit a target precisely enough to matter is not a simple manufacturing job. It is closer to building a small spacecraft than assembling a standard missile off a normal production line, because the materials, the heat shielding, and the guidance tolerances all have to be qualified individually. And that complexity carries a price. Somewhere between $40 and $50 million per unit before a single missile is fired. There is a reason that price has stayed high for years, instead of coming down the way most weapons systems eventually do once production ramps up. A hypersonic glide vehicle does not get cheaper through volume the way a standard missile does, because the limiting factor is not the assembly line. It is the small number of facilities anywhere in the country qualified to build heat shielding and guidance components to this tolerance in the first place. That number is where the equation starts to bend. Let us run the actual numbers. A single long-range hypersonic weapon, or conventional prompt strike missile, costs somewhere between $40 and $50 million to build. The contract the Navy just signed with Castelion puts 50 Blackbeard missiles into production for $23,400,000 combined, which works out to an average of roughly $468,000 per missile at this early production stage. Divide one number by the other, and the ratio is not subtle. For the price of a single premium hypersonic weapon, the Navy could field something close to 85 lower-cost missiles instead. That is not a rounding error or a marketing comparison. That is what the contract numbers actually produce when you put them side by side. It helps to picture what 85 missiles actually represents next to one. It is not a slight numerical edge. It is the difference between a single weapon that can be fired once, maybe twice in a campaign, and an inventory deep enough to absorb losses, mistakes, and multiple engagements without the Navy running out of options halfway through a fight it did not get to choose the length of. That gap is not a discount on the same product. It is a different category of manufacturing entirely. A $40 million missile is closer to a handcrafted instrument than a mass-produced round, built in small batches, using materials and tolerances that take years to qualify, by a production base that was never designed to move fast in the first place. The cost is not a flaw in the program. It is the design choice. Precision at that level has never been cheap, and nobody who engineered these weapons ever expected it to be. But that design choice creates a different kind of question. One that has nothing to do with whether the missile works once it leaves the launcher. If one weapon in the arsenal costs as much as 85 of the weapons meant to sit alongside it, how many of those 85 does a fleet actually need before the conversation stops being about performance and starts being about supply? That is not a hypothetical question for a procurement office. It is the question that decides how many of these contracts get signed in the years ahead. Because performance was never the part of this equation that was in doubt. Supply always was, and supply is the half of this story that rarely makes it into a headline. Money alone does not fix the other half of this problem. Even with an unlimited budget, a production line built to hand-assemble a $40 million missile cannot suddenly start turning them out at the pace a sustained fight would demand. These are not parts pulled from a shelf and bolted together on a fast timeline. Building one of these vehicles can take years from order to delivery, because the tolerances, the heat-resistant materials, and the qualification testing do not compress just because someone writes a bigger check at the start of the process. That production ceiling runs straight into a second physical limit that has nothing to do with budget at all. Every ship and aircraft that carries these weapons only has so many vertical launch cells, or so many pylons, to put them on. Magazine depth is not an abstract concept in this conversation. It is a fixed number of slots on a real hull or a real wing. And once those slots are empty, the only way to refill them is to wait for a factory that is already running as fast as it physically can. This is not a new constraint unique to hypersonic weapons. Every advanced missile a warship carries competes for the same limited cell space, and every expensive system the fleet adopts makes that competition tighter. What changes with a $40 million weapon is how much is lost every time one of those slots gets used, and how long the wait is before it can be filled again, sometimes measured in months rather than days. Put those two limits together, and a short, high-intensity engagement looks very different from a sustained one. A fleet that fires its premium hypersonic inventory in the opening days of a real conflict may not see a replacement missile arrive for months, not because anyone in the program failed, but because that is how long this class of weapon has always taken to build, contract or no contract. A devastating weapon that the magazine cannot hold and the factory cannot replace has a tactical value that depends entirely on how long the fight lasts. If the ship wins every engagement but empties its launch cells doing it, the real question is not what it just shot down. It is what gets loaded into that empty cell next, and how long the wait is before anything arrives to fill it. This is where Castelion's contract actually matters. And it is not because Blackbeard is a better missile. It is not. It does not claim the same range, the same payload class, or the same engineering pedigree as the long-range hypersonic weapon, and the contract does not pretend otherwise. What it claims instead is a different manufacturing philosophy, built around a different question entirely. Blackbeard is built using commercial, off-the-shelf components wherever the design allows it, rather than custom qualifying every part the way a premium hypersonic glide vehicle requires from the ground up. That choice is what makes the current average cost of roughly $468,000 per missile possible at all, even at this early production stage, with research and setup costs still baked into that early lot price. Castelion's stated target, once production scales past this first batch of 50, is closer to $300,000 per unit. The logic is closer to how a car or a drone gets built than how a handcrafted glide vehicle gets built. Use parts that already exist, already pass quality checks, and already get manufactured at volume for other industries, and reserve the custom engineering for the parts that genuinely need it. That is a fundamentally different starting assumption than the one behind the premium hypersonic class, and it is the assumption that makes a $468,000 price tag possible in the first place. That gap between $468,000 and $300,000 is not a red flag, and it does not mean the program is behind schedule. It is what an early production run on almost any new weapons line looks like before the assembly process matures and the per-unit cost settles toward its real target. The number that matters here is not where the price starts. It is where the production rate goes from this contract forward. This is not a downgrade dressed up as innovation. It is a calculated trade-off. Give up some performance ceiling in exchange for a missile that can actually be built in the volume a sustained fight requires. 100 good enough weapons assembled on a commercial timeline can sit in a magazine in a way that 2 or 3 handcrafted ones never will, no matter how capable each one is on its own. The reversal here has nothing to do with which missile looks more advanced on a spec sheet. It has everything to do with which one the fleet can still afford to fire on day 30 of a fight that was never supposed to last that long in the first place. None of this means the US Navy is walking away from the long-range hypersonic weapon or the conventional prompt strike missile. Those programs are not being canceled, and the capability they bring to the fleet is not being replaced by a cheaper substitute. What this contract actually shows is that the Navy is building a second tier underneath them, one priced and produced for a fight that does not end after the first exchange of missiles. 85 lower-cost missiles for the price of one premium weapon is not a comparison anyone makes for fun, and it is not a comparison anyone needed to make 20 years ago. It is the kind of math a military starts running only once it stops, assuming the next conflict will be short, contained, and over before the magazine empties. That assumption has gotten harder to make every year, and this contract is what it looks like when a procurement office stops making it. On paper, the $40 million missile wins every engagement it is used in. In the magazine, it is the $468,000 missile that is still sitting there on day 30, ready to load, while the premium tier waits months, sometimes years, for the next unit to come off a production line that was never built to hurry. The fleet does not need every missile in its inventory to be the best missile in the world. It needs enough missiles left in the cells to still be fighting once the war is no longer new, and the cameras have moved on to something else, and that is a number this contract just started to build toward. If you want to follow the mission, this is the fleet that breaks down the real numbers behind US military power. Subscribe